I'm Sheena Connell from the University of Pretoria, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the event this afternoon. I'm particularly welcoming ASSAf members, as well as my fellow hosts, co-hosts on the panel. In particular, Professor Saths Cooper, we're deeply honored to have you here. Professor Maharaj from UKZN, as well as Professor Burton is not yet on the call. A few rules and housekeeping questions regarding the event today. Could you all please post questions in the Q&A section? It will be addressed at the end of the session by one of my colleagues. The recording and the slides for this event will be shared following this event. And can you kindly keep your microphones and videos muted or turned off? I'll give you a second or two to do that. For those of you who are new to ASSAf, ASSAf is an independent non-profit organization that was established in 1996 with a mandate to promote and advance science in South Africa. It serves as the National Academy of Science in the country, bringing together leading scientists and scholars to provide expert advice on scientific matters and to promote the development of science and research in South Africa, whilst connected and recognized both nationally and internationally. ASSAf's role includes advancing science advisory in priority societal issues and recognizing and celebrating our democracy. Regarding the Annual Humanities Lecture, it is a significant event on the ASSAf calendar, and the inaugural lecture was held 9th of March 2017. The purpose of this prestigious event is to promote the humanities in the country and to draw attention to its relevance among school learners, university students, scholars, and the broader contemporary South African society, as well as foster dialogue on relevant issues. As a humanities scholar, this discipline allows us to ask those difficult questions of who we are and how we live. And I think today's lecture in particular will strike at the heart of these complex threads that we find ourselves in the contemporary moment. This lecture series aims to foster discussion and to think about those complex societal concerns and seemingly insurmountable dilemmas within ASSAf and its multidisciplinary suite of activities and projects. By hosting this annual lecture, ASSAf underscores the value of the humanities in contributing to a well-rounded and informed society. It does so by inviting a leading humanities scholar to deliver a lecture on a question that is of interest to the country, and in this instance, the globe. We've been fortunate to have speakers who, through their expertise and abilities, engaged a broad audience in meaningful discussions. Previous lectures have focused on student uprisings of 2015, the significance of Steve Biko for thinking about human equality, and the role of intellectuals for the policy of apartheid. I'm going to be handing over to Prof. Brij Maharaj, who is a professor of geography and a B-rated NRF scholar at UKZN with an H index of 34. He's a member of ASSAf and a fellow of the Society of South African Geographers. Prof. Maharaj has received widespread international recognition for his research on urban politics, mega events, segregation, local economic development, xenophobia and human rights, migration and diasporas, religion, philanthropy, and development. He has published over 170 scholarly papers in renowned journals and edited book collections. Prof. Maharaj is the Vice Chairperson of the ASSAf Humanities Standing Committee. He's a regular media commentator on topical issues as part of his commitment to public intellectualism. He's also the Deputy President of the South African Hindu Mahasabha. Over to you, Prof. Maharaj.
Thank you, Siona, for that introduction. Good afternoon, colleagues from ASSAf, all our online guests, and above all, our keynote speaker, Professor Cooper. I have the privilege and honor to introduce a friend and colleague. Prof. Cooper is the president of the Pan-African Psychology Union and the past president of the International Union of Psychological Science and the Psychological Society of South Africa. Prof. Cooper is a fellow of the Psychological Societies of South Africa, India, Ireland, Britain, and Nigeria. He's a governing board member of the International Science Council and a foundation fellow serving on his Committee for Freedom and Responsibility in Science. Prof. Cooper was a close colleague of the Black Consciousness Movement founder, the late Bantu Steve Biko. At the age of 22, Cooper was banned, placed under house arrest, and thereafter jailed for 9 years, 5 of which were spent in the same cell block as the late South African President Mandela. He was accused, number one, in the seminal South African Students' Organization Black People's Convention trial, a leader of the struggle against apartheid oppression and exploitation from the late 1960s. He obtained his PhD from Boston University as a Fulbright scholar. Prof. Cooper has taught at the universities of Witwatersrand, Boston, and the Western Cape. He also served as the last Vice-Chancellor of the University of Devon Westfield before it merged to form UK's Denver Natal. Prof. Cooper chairs the Robben Island Museum and the 1970s group of activists. I do recall that he also served on the board of the SABC. The title of his talk is very relevant. Are we failing our youth? Over to you, Saths.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. And I greet all of you in the leadership and membership of ASSAf and all of those joining us this afternoon. It's my singular pleasure to share some thoughts with you on our troubled times. I'm going to cover the urgent issues confronting our youth and as it affects our common humanity in its diversity, convergence, and quest for social stability, justice, and dealing with the terrible economic and environmental conditions that we do confront. I am asking, are we creating lost generations amongst us? I'm going to deal with youth and particularly deal with some intergenerational factors impacting displaced societies on the continent. I'll attempt to provide some context, particularly for us in this country and the rest of the continent, and address, hopefully, the role of the humanities, which has tended to become a poor cousin, a terrible stepchild. I'm going to use conventional words, but in the service of a functionalist education that merely churns out people as producers in an economy that they actually play no role in shaping. That, I believe, is seriously part of the displacement of the humanities in favor of certain areas. And if we look back on ASSAf studies, we'll find that at the turn of democracy, there were certain subjects that first-year students entering universities chose, and that changed over time. It changed to public administration because of the need for a job. I do suspect, though, that a significant percentage of those who may have qualified appropriately, maybe not in public administration, but in other areas, have not been taken up by government. And this, together with a very utilitarian approach to education, it must be in the service of some immediate outcome so that I can get money and the consequent enemy that arises from this set of circumstances. I'll try to offer a slightly different but inclusive trajectory for what tends to be at best for all of us a very fractured future. based on this fragile present. We have a fast-changing geopolitical order. The technological revolution has overtaken the whole of the world. Forget that one of the revolutions was electricity for a moment. There's been a rise of narrow nationalism throughout the world. And interestingly, I noted a few years ago that the person leading the Danish Socialist Party was attempting to be even right of the candidates on the right in her constituency. Globally, and particularly after the devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been worsening socioeconomic and political, therefore, conditions that all of us confront. These pose threats to all of us everywhere. Health, education, decent living conditions, and the consequences of that, water, nutrition, sanitation, and so on, and the right to dignity, which is protected in our Constitution. These are not important daily issues confronting many of us in academia and in the humanities. Social sciences I'll include for the sake of completeness. We tend to be latter day, vaguely interested in some of these. We know that in 3-4 years' time, the UN will start mobilizing around the next agenda for itself. Previously, it was the Millennium Development Goals, now the SDGs. They'll come together, they'll decide that most of these have been met, and the world ought to be a better place, but the reality tells us otherwise. We've had these important environmental agreements. We've had a continuing thread of the continent's fortunes being determined elsewhere. The humanities, the arts, the social sciences have tended to be just vague parties when these things have happened. And we've sometimes ended up being very good vertically in our disciplinary areas. The result is we have lost the horizontal thread, and we seem to play almost no role in policy formulation, policy translation, and yet those we've trained them. They may have had masters, if you're lucky, but usually an honors degree, and they're taken up by consulting firms, the big ones, shamed ones in Zondo, and they're the ones who provide that advice at huge cost to government. And we're seeing the consequences of that stupidity, where we don't utilize the expertise that's available to us, amongst us. We confront huge levels. The levels measured in any way defy understanding, really, of youth alienation, serious disaffection from everything. The largest unemployment in the world, the lowest employment, and violence and wars that we witness in real time. Now, the Human Development Report of 2020 and the UN Development Program does this. Previously, it was based on narrow economic growth alone, where they measure longevity, they measure education, they measure living standards, and use GDP and measure and decide on a human development index. The pandemic, of course, impacted us severely, and that 2020 report does place store on that. But it does say empowered people can unleash real-world transformation by changing social norms. Now, easier said than done by those who wrote that report, because there aren't any systems really on the continent that allow for empowerment, let alone opportunity to transform the worlds that we occupy, the spaces, even the little bubbles that we occupy, to change terrible prevailing norms. That report put human freedoms at the core and talked of ethical, evaluative framing and sustainability, and talked about changed behaviors. It's easy to talk about those, but doing them is something else. Importantly, though, it mentions that the groups concentrating and benefiting from power are the colonials, the G20 countries, privileged groups, elites. We know that in our country, the nomenclatura have prevailed in whatever form and however they continue to name themselves, and large companies. In our context, the largest companies have exited this country, particularly in their primary listings. The disadvantaged groups are the colonies. We, on the entire continent, effectively are a colony, have remained so. If we listen to George Friedman, at least for 100 years. You can take it from the period of slavery, the 1400s, when Pope Alexander, was it, who allowed for certain things to happen for Columbus to then claim the US as a territory. Racial, ethnic minorities, low-earning workers, and local communities are the disadvantaged groups. I want to just pause on communities. There is seriously no sense of community in our country. The communities that some of us, and if we do remember, Bridge and I and a few older people here will remember that we grew up in places where if you weren't at school when you were supposed to be at school, the auntie next door, the old man in the corner would ensure that you would stop you and ask you, why are you here? The sense of knowing who was living below the poverty line and sharing, that sense of sharing, that sense of communal interaction simply does not exist. Yet, we are fond of talking about our communities as if we still have that sense of community. What we have, and that's a serious problem in this society, is a Bantustanization of the mind, where the foot failed, successive ministers of education succeeded. So this generation, the next generation, says the report, inherits all of this. Now, the report published in March this year says 1 in 5 live in acute, multidimensional, crossing sectors, and half of them are in Africa. Yet, the majority of the developing and developed world are in Africa, extracting from Africa the wealth that is still there. So you have uneven development progress, obviously, in inequality rising and polarization. It's notable that 78% of the 50 poorest countries are in Africa, and that does not include Sahrawi because it does not hit the statistic. It does not include certain countries like Zimbabwe who fight against being included in the lowest poverty levels or poorest countries in terms of HDI. If we ignored the political impact, this figure would be larger for the continent. Now, let's come to a figure given this last month, this week, by UCT's Children's Institute. It's required that we have 760 Rand per person per month to live above the poverty datum line. Yet, we have a quarter of our children stunted, and this does not mean physical stunting alone, particularly cognitive and brain functioning, and that 70% of our children live below the poverty line. 1 in 3 survive below that poverty line, suffering endemic and chronic malnutrition. So the lack of food, what they call the intergenerational cycle of malnutrition and poverty, does impact us, and we need to take note of that. Now, coming back to a little bit of history, the correct name for the Conference on Africa was the Berlin West African Conference on the Congo River Basin, which started the subsequent so-called scramble for Africa. But as I pointed out, for some 800 years, from chattel slavery onwards, Africa has been a target of wealth stealth and robbery. The unifier of Germany presided and forced these countries to agree not to fight each other and agreed on the borders that we now have in Africa. The figures given behind each country are the HDIs of those countries. The HDI scale is from 0 to 1, the lowest being obviously 0 into 0.55. The very high is 0.8 upwards. Not one of these countries is not in the very high bracket. Russia included after the war in Ukraine. Notably then, not one of those countries has not benefited previously and through colonization and currently through extraction economies in Africa from African wealth. Now, Richard Munang in 2016 said that some 240 million people go to bed hungry, and that malnutrition kills half of our children, and most of whom die before the age of 5. I need to just point out that early mother-child intervention during President Mandela's presidency, founding presidency of our democracy, showed a sharp rise in a better infant mortality and mother-child healthy rate than is currently prevalent. The belief that Africa is a young continent because of its age, has a rapidly growing population, yet the vast majority unemployed. And these effects impact them. And he says, we can't rise unless young people provide leadership. So listening to ourselves only is part of that problem. In our classrooms, we need to have those we engage with, those we teach, I'm not going to use the politically correct words that tend to get used and then mask mediocrity. That we are not leveraging the tech savviness to mobilize for better policies. Some statistics, then, we have the youngest population globally in Africa, yet 70% live on some $2 a day. The unemployment is, especially amongst youth, is higher than 60%. So poverty, lack of opportunity have precipitated and have caused huge challenges. These include these I've listed here, and migration becomes important. For the last 10 years, nearly every day, we have had newscast after newscast telling us about people in the Mediterranean. More recently, from Arab countries, including from far away as Afghanistan, taking to boats. I recall last week, I think it was on Wednesday, on one of the British channels, Sophie Ridge was talking about that dinghy that simply tore apart. And there were no wave conditions, no storms, but it just was totally unsafe. It must take serious courage, colleagues, to throw yourself pregnant or to throw your child into a dinghy for lands that you've known are unwelcome to you, that you've known will treat you terribly, but where you think you have a better future. And that's because in Africa, we have a failure of leadership. So Munang says these challenges, if left unaddressed, will constrict longer-term development. I believe that the antidote to the dangerous susceptibility to fundamentalism, whatever the belief is, which radicalizes vulnerable young people to become couriers of terror and carriers of mindless hate, is a natural but abnormal consequence of this. You'll find that in oil-rich Arab states, the majority of young people are part of that proneness to be radicalized because they have become surplus people in the land of their birth. In our own country, the majority, and I get very scared when former political comrades start talking against other Africans. That Afrophobia that is part of us is something that speaks to our disability to acknowledge who we are. And after all, science tells us that some 94 to 96% of the world's population can in some way trace DNA to the oldest living ethnic group in the world, the Khomani San, living in the southern Kalahari Desert, bordering Namibia, Botswana, and South Africa. So there aren't quick fix solutions to what seems to be historic challenges that continue. 30 years ago, I wrote a piece, and I'm repeating that here, on political violence and the role of youth. Because some things have changed, but others haven't. To understand the role of why violence plays such an important foregrounding in all that we do, we need to look further than the immediate, and time doesn't permit that. But youth were at the forefront of our struggle. After the signal events of March 21st, 1960, with the anti-pass campaign. And some narratives still say 69 people were killed, when more recent research done at morgues, registers, and so on, tell us that it's way over 100. Tells you about how the old narratives continue in the present and how we have not kept up with the actual research to make some of these areas alive for our younger audiences that we engage with, whether in the classroom or outside. But from that event, Vervoet banned the ANC and PAC the following month. There was no political organization left in the country. People were banned, some were arrested, others left the country, or many were just went into quiet subjugation. The Bantustanization of the country was imminent. In that space, students, those of us in our late teens and early 20s, decided we are not going to allow this unnatural picture to emerge. And thus, Steve Biko, the South African Students' Organization, emerged, and unusually, a student movement creates a political organization. Usually, it's that political organization that creates a worker body, that creates a women's league, student wing, etc., etc. But that is where we had youth leadership, culminating in June 16th, 1976. Our inability, the reflection of history as that written by victors. The ANC was victorious and chose in May, June 1994 to declare certain holidays. March 21st was not recognized for obvious reasons, because it was led by a breakaway, which became the Pan-Africanist Congress. And June 16th was not recognized because they were not involved in it. Although many people have tried in master's and doctoral dissertations to show the ANC hand. 2020 hindsight is foolproof. Nobody can question that. But the reality is that day was not chosen because it did not suit the ruling power. Arguably, June 16, 1994 was the biggest public holiday ever. Go back on that time. People stayed away. They were not asked to stay away, but they did because they recognized the significance of youth leadership. And yet, that has not followed through in our society. Youth who were central to struggle were put on the peripheries, and the bulk of young people remain on those peripheries now. We also have not attended to the devastation, and politicians all over the world talk about family and values. And the more they talk about family and values, deep inside them is a conservatism that enables them to spout family when they do very little to ensure its sustenance. Although they're unable really to recognize new forms of family that are in existence in this century. Be that as it may, the devastation in the family and family structures, particularly Black families and very significantly African families, is immense. Last year, the representative of the Johannesburg housing entity was talking about the Dube hostile development that it's now ready for people to occupy as families, ignoring the historicity of what the community had been raising from the time that hostels became a target for transformation. In the same way, then, our government has not been able to deal with these issues, which then assume different forms in the current society. Our youth, historically, then, from the time of the advent of gold, the discovery of gold, very little significant socialization from elders, and into the period from the 70s until now. It is very clear the majority of us have grown up in single-parent homes. The minority have had your classic nuclear family background. And this goes across class, it goes across whatever color or race or other categorization we may want to have. Peer socialization then has been very significant, it remains significant, and that's why every few weeks we hear about something happening in school and it going viral, and we wonder about the symptom displayed rather than what causes these problems. This serious deterioration in our circumstances, the lack of any attempt to bridge the gap to ensure that a little of what these people spout as national and other development plans can come to fruition. So, young people, individual youth, and here I am not going to rely on the ANC's definition of you're a young person if you're under 35. I'm using the definition all of us use usually, and that is you're a youth until your mid-20s. I heard a minister that I actually know and fairly like years ago explaining it's a UN definition. I said it cannot be, because I know my union, the International Union of Psychological Science, at that time I was its vice president, cannot have a youth representative at the United Nations if the person is over 25. So we tend to use language in its exception. And that we've learned very well from our apartheid teachers. You know, the Extension of University Education Act, which meant curtailing universities into tribal colleges. It did not talk about past laws. It used other language, which I'm forgetting just now. But our legislation is replete with euphemism, saying one thing meaning something else. So young people have had to then their frustrations, and now they contained in the peripheries. And if a group of them ventures beyond those spaces into the commercial and into suburbia, they will be pounced upon by fellow Black police. I recall when I was 15 in Warwick Avenue at the intersection, I saw two burly blackjacks, municipal police who were African were called blackjacks because they wore black uniforms, unlike the other metropolitan police. And their job was to arrest anybody who was in the metropolitan area without a reference book or pass. When you hit 16 years of age, you had to carry that pass on yourself at all times, even asleep. If you were found and you could pull it out very quickly from next to you, you'd be saved. Otherwise, you'd be arrested. A large part of growing agriculture, of growing certain industries in this country came from such labor, and we haven't dealt with that. So I went to those policemen and said, "Why are you beating this kid?" Quote unquote. And they stopped. They said, "Do you know him?" I said, "No, but he's like me. He could be my age. Why are you doing this?" "Well, you know," and I said, "But this is the past laws. You are black. Why are you doing this on behalf of the white regime?" And they stopped. The kid was bleeding. I gave him my handkerchief to wipe off the blood on his face, and he was stuck against, he was on the floor against the fence. The sergeant walks from the Kwela gray pickup truck, comes to me, asks me the same question. I repeat it, and I say, "You shouldn't be beating children," and so on. And he says, "Well, look, you've made your point. Move on or we'll arrest you." That ended my protest, but the kid returned the handkerchief. This was like at night you're driving and you see an animal and that animal's eyes looking up at you, plaintively. I said, "No, you need it more. Please keep it." From that day, I've never used a handkerchief. So the environment in which our youth grow tends to be influenced by that which is around them. I was earlier speaking to a media person and said, if you went into Fordsburg, the stench, the decay is palpable, the deterioration. If you went then to Hillbrow, you see children walking into their apartments, passing heaps of rubbish, dirt, decay, and deterioration. Children are growing up with this as if it is normal. There is a weird socialization happening in our society, and it plays itself out in every aspect of our lives. In whatever space is occupied, that plays a role. So in that era, until democracy, the law was looked upon as not the upholder of human rights, but as the destroyer. But then you and I know, Andres Tatane, you and I know that in August 2012, Marikana and butchering happening by police in the democratic era. If that had happened under apartheid, would we have been muted as we are and have been because it was done by our own people? So the police, thankfully in this administration, they seem to have gotten a bit of a wake-up call. I remember the outgoing Gauteng Commissioner of Police, General Elias Mawela, saying in Parliament years ago, when he was the head of public order policing. And remember, in democracy, when you have public order policing, what are you saying to your country? These are people protecting what against whom, and protecting whom against what. But he had the courage to state that the protests and the public demonstrations that they had to confront did not have law and order as its basis. These were socioeconomic, political issues that needed to be resolved elsewhere. And this is years ago. So since then, have we inspired confidence? Our police being protected in their police stations, being disarmed, and yet in liberated countries, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, you cannot walk with a firearm. You'll be arrested. We are Wild West. The kinds of early shootings that happen daily in the US and gets transported to us instantly on our little devices all over. Wait for that now to become a classroom phenomenon in our country. And it will, if we continue ignoring all the signs as we have successfully done so for the last 30 years. But since then, young people have not been engaged fully. And we've seen the fallist movement, Fees, Roads Must Fall movement. And we've seen internationally people take to the streets after George Floyd's murder. In this country, though, the country where racism after Nazism and the Holocaust was regarded as a crime against humanity, we had almost nothing. Because so engrossed are we in ourselves and our own issues that our ability to empathize with anybody else has totally been taken away through a warped socialization that's made apartheid thinking normal. So there were the glorious few years, not much more than a couple during Mandela's first term, where reconciliation and reconstruction tended to work. But the majority who were at the forefront of struggle were pushed to the sideline. The Mandelas strode center stage. Youth succumbed, agreeing to elder leadership, but the subsequent elder leadership has regarded them as so much surplus people who they wish to completely forget are around. So who is oppressor and who is oppressed becomes more complicated in our current system. And you've heard this during this last election, people saying apartheid was better. The marginalization of then persists today. And this will not simply disappear. Instead, what we've had is that sense of entitlement that I alluded to earlier, where we put ourselves first. Parents put themselves first before their children. Very unnatural, but it's happening more and more. In Durban, where I spent my childhood and youth, there's a phrase they use of I specialist, meaning me, myself, and I. That's it. In apartheid terminology, that's a group. 3 people constituted a group. So it's easy then to ignore youth, the impact of what we do to them. It's adults behaving badly. And when in this period you need beacons of hope, the humanities, the arts, literature, performance, cultural expression only comes up this month when it's the month we are supposed to celebrate culture. We're supposed to be part of that as an innate experience, and it's supposed to be given flesh to an affirmation through the humanities, which have become cut and have become a nuisance in almost all universities in our country. Instead, that functionalist, an expectation for a job situation has arisen. I was shocked last year to see the group of jobs that the president had approved for people to be recruited from abroad on. It included call center agents. Now, all of us know that despite our accents, there are many call centers in this country serving large parts of the world. But to think of a call center agent being a scarce area and to provide that to somebody else than a South African who can speak English very well, by the way, and often unaccented. Sometimes it becomes almost hilarious when you hear the accents emerging from those same persons taking the mickey out of themselves. But you see, we haven't got that attunement with our cultural sense of belonging that we actually need. What instead replaces it is a narrow ethnic nationalism or a chauvinist approach to culture. You know these phrases. In the local language, that tree is about us. And it's how we grow that tree. And I know all universities talk of growing our own timber, but are we really doing that and thoroughly? Should we not be rethinking how we expose fresher students to the university through areas that they can easily identify with, and not to make the choices at matric for a career when they're totally unprepared for it? There needs to be a drastic rethink of our entire education system in this country. And culture, languages, the arts, philosophy, history underpin that. Go to any successful country where kids don't know their own history, and I will take a vow of eternal silence. South Africa is such a country. Can we progress in that vein? That child will burn down the village, and we then get shocked when a library is burnt. You know, all of us are shocked by when a library is burnt. But what have we done to make that child feel that library is hers, and she benefits from that library, even if it has colonial tomes? But Professor so-and-so, my graduate assistant so-and-so, is decolonizing that and changing the narrative. The enemy is within us. So Shakespeare said this: the fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. And we can blame anybody, but at this stage, 30 years after democracy, we need to look at that leadership that has completely failed us, continues to fail us, and who we pay absolute obeisance to. George Bernard Shaw in the late 19th century talked of indifference, saying the worst sin towards our fellow creatures is not to hate them, but be indifferent. That's the essence of inhumanity. And really, if you look at what our people want, you'll be surprised by how little they're looking for to be part of what is going on, to merely exist. I already gave you the shocking statistics of 7 in 10 children living below the poverty datum line, and 1 in 3 completely beyond that reach. That indifference, when it comes to people who are able to speak from different orifices at the same time, but completely are indifferent to those they purport to represent, we know we are in trouble. Can we change this? First of all, we need to rise above the marks of our origin. Recognize that we have to work together. We have to work in an interdisciplinary way while ensuring excellence vertically. The quest for our common humanity is the underpinning for this. So you can ask, was Fukuyama correct when he said the end of history, where liberal democracies, laissez-faire capitalism will end humanity's social, cultural evolution? Or has the real geopolitical struggle begun? George Feldman talked of the major geopolitical trends of the 21st century. And so far has been proven to be fairly right with the changes that are happening. The ignoring of technology taking over our lives, the declaring of redundancy of the majority, and yet every electoral party talks of a job that's not going to be created. Who is going to create that job when technology has replaced people? There are other ways of being and of living, which, because of the stupidity and the ignorance of our leadership, we get seduced by and continue to remain thinking that that will happen. The worst unemployment in the world, the lowest employment rate in the world can change, but it's not going to change to a majoritarian situation, and we need to change to adapt to ensuring that those children, born and yet to be born, in our schools, in our universities, and outside, are given a different deal than fraud that we're perpetrating on them right now. Our democracy's fault lines are clearly laid bare for all of us to see, and intellectuals have to come to the fore. We cannot afford to be co-opted again. We have been previously, and I know very few who participated in the apartheid system acknowledged their participation. Most claim they fought it. If they did fight it, we wouldn't have had it survive for that long. The hegemony of politics in our lives, particularly mediocre politics, is something that is going to be our bane. And despite all this, the human spirit, in its quest for freedom, in our ability to regain our common humanity, remains as it did in those watershed marks of Sharpeville and June 16. We cannot afford to have a July 2021. I believe that how we treat the worst amongst us underpins our own claim to being human. We cannot ignore, colleagues, our children, our youth, as we will participate willy-nilly in destroying their and our common future. I thank you.
Thank you, Saths. for a very thought-provoking and provocative ASSAf Humanities lecture. And I'm not going to even try to summarize the points you've made. Someone is going to come in at the end, and a colleague will be trying to draw the points together very briefly. But I think the message is clear. We dare not fail the youth and the young people, or else there'll be no future. I'm going to go straight away for questions. I've got a chat. Raj from the office is going to help me here. So, Saths, I'm going to take a few questions and about 3 at a time, and then you can respond. Right? I haven't summarized them. There may be some overlap. So there's a question from Ahmad Juma. And he says, or he's talking about limited skills. He says there are tax specialists apparently in the scarce skills, and there are thousands of commerce graduates still looking for jobs. So why are they being trained? Yeah, again, there's a repeat of the tax question. Then we have Nixon Sabanda to all panelists. Spatial planning is still discriminatory. Youth in Winterfeld need 110 rands to travel to Pretoria CBD and back. It is a story of all townships which are from any place where they can seek employment. Most are now going to the 30s with no employment opportunities. It's frightening that we may have a generation of people who have never worked at all. You want to comment on that, Saths?
Yes, that's a reality, and that's why the question we asked in 1983, Ahmed Juma was at Wits then. Are we creating a lost generation, we asked, because it was soon after 76. And we saw young people take to the streets. We saw them in perpetual revolt against that appalling system that we've just emerged from in some ways. I think we've created lost generations. I think we have tended to forget those that have been raised since then and who have not seen and had the opportunity to have contributed to themselves and their families. I'm not going to say a job, because there are other ways to sustain oneself. That limitation to a job is part of the problem, and we need to start rethinking how we think of the world of work, because it's become very, very circumscribed. I agree that, I pointed to the trend that people in the 70s, in the 80s, everyone was aspiring to be a chartered accountant because you became quite rich when you became a chartered accountant. There are chartered accountants now walking the streets. Engineers are in vogue. They tend to control many companies. But if you've not run a spaza shop, how will you run a company? Having the BCom behind you, and you haven't applied that knowledge, and you haven't had anybody from your family and in the neighborhood, I'm not going to talk of anything else, because I'm just going to say neighborhood, in those areas to give you some guidance. It's a losing race. We've got huge numbers of, especially teachers, who are out there. Some of them make more money doing private tuition than they do at university and wherever they're employed. But we're shedding the Western Cape, this bastion of modernity and everything else, is shedding teachers' jobs at a time when you should be increasing the number of teachers in our schools. That is part of the problem, because you need to educate to mediate the environment rather than educate merely with a narrow skill. And even as Ahmed Juma points out, you've got people who study tax, but that becomes a scarce skill, as if somebody from the US is going to be able to tell you more than you know about GARP and all those other things. So we actually are really digging ourselves into further holes that we are going to be unable to come out of if we, in the humanities and related areas, don't raise our voices about what is happening to us and our children. We'll come back here at the end of this 7th administration's term and make the realization that maybe 5 of those ministers did very well, and there will be people screaming their praises. But generally, what they have inherited, and some of them have been part of that problem, they're not going to merely solve. They cannot simply solve it without our intervention, without our knowledge, without our experience, and importantly, evidence, because we have that evidence. The questions put here have evidence to them, which we haven't used in our policy making. And it's about time that we did.
Thank you. Thank you, Saths. I just want to respond to Nixon Sibanda. I'm a geographer, so Nixon, I agree with you that the spatial geography of apartheid has been reinforced over the past 30 years. And that means poor people will travel longer distances to work, for services if they get them, and even to schools. Derek Pagliacci is talking about the youth were also failed in the past. We agree with that. Are we overpopulated globally and have scarce skills? We don't have enough for all the people living on Earth. Before Saths comes in here, just to say, Derek, there's a global shortage of skills. It's very interesting. Even the accountants that Saths referred to, the US will grab all our accountants if they have an opportunity. There's a global shortage of skills. The population is declining in the global north, and most recently in China. Can you imagine China is now feeling the consequences of their own population policy? Saths, I think that you've covered that, right?
Yeah.
The spatial planning is come back. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Pula Malifana to all panelists. Prof. Cooper, what would you attribute the lack of patriotism and cultural orientation among the youth, given the conditions pre-1994 were much harsher, unbearable as compared to post-94? I know you're going to love this. You're responding to this one, Saths.
Look, I think basically we've had poor leadership. And remember the issues, I mean, this is an annual humanities lecture. And long before mergers, basically acquisitions by the metropolitan universities, right, happened, we had cutbacks. We had serious cutbacks. The Baxter Theatre was part of UCT. There was a theatre at UDW. There were theatres at Natal University. Where are they now? Right? That's only one aspect of the humanities. In our schools, we're not ensuring that our children who are able to be polyglots, if introduced to language at an early age, they're not introduced to languages that prevail in their immediate environment, which they can easily pick up. Otherwise, they'll be disabled, like some of us on this platform, who can only speak a small clutch of languages, and then too, some very badly. But if we have the ability to understand each other and greet each other and engage and understand each other's customs. Yes, we understand each other's food at a certain level, but we don't really understand culture beyond that. And the short answer to that question is, our leadership has been bereft itself of such culture, with a few exceptions in President Mandela's first cabinet. Many of them, you know, at that rendezvous of victory, many of them were actually half human beings. They actually were terrified of the people who were their security guards, because those were the guys who had imprisoned them. And yes, I haven't dealt with all the issues that I ought to have dealt with, but I've alluded a little to the fact that we call certain places townships, the rest are suburbs. That already, epistemically, tells us how we've become used to language that tends to divide, and worse, language that tends to create othering and hate, and then becomes violent. Because violence is not merely the physical violence, it's also epistemic violence that comes through how we think and how we use words ourselves and against other people. All of that is continuing to go towards, and I'm watching what Enver Daniels, who was our first state attorney in the country, has raised, globalization. That globalization, remember that in 1652, when the Dutch East India Company came here, it was the world's first multinational corporation. It got bankrupt and was taken over by the British East India Company. Since then, all these countries have benefited from Batavia, from Africa, from other places that they tended to colonize. They took slaves from or took slaves to. And that loss is immense. We tend to also believe, and particularly after the George Floyd saga, you will recall that there was, I think it was in Bedford, that a slave owner's statue was thrown into the pond, the river or the little harbor. A colleague of mine said to me from the UK, that slave owner didn't make his money from the slave trade. He made it from insuring the slaves. So when they died in passage, he got his money. And I said to myself and to her, wait for Lloyd's to respond. And within a week, Lloyd said it recognizes the past and will ensure that it includes Black people in their boardrooms within the next 10 years. Okay? Having you and I in those boardrooms, and remember our current president boardroom at one time, and there was a criticism against him that he was sleeping in those meetings and wasn't able to contribute because he wasn't reading the documents. That's globalization acting locally, where very few of our companies don't have global connections. And who are we making rich? Note that also during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, the largest number of billionaires was announced. I think some 26 billionaires, new billionaires, was announced from the poverty of the rest of the world. So that will continue. The exit of capital, you know, the gold mines, the diamond mine, Anglo and De Beers. You know, Anglo, I think, has an office upstairs here with one of its foundations that I think has been funding at least 5 or 6 parties. They have made money from democracy. News 24, the apartheid newspapers are listed in Rotterdam. They're making money not only from that, but from 50 Cent and a few other entities. So the people we're talking about who control our economy, and those amongst us who get co-opted into their black fronts and faces, play that game for their own ends. So I think job is easier said than done. And what we do need to do is actually engage vigorously, challenging in the way that some of you have been raising questions. And I know we'll continue to raise those questions, because we cannot come out with a simple slogan as if it's going to apply to all conditions across all aspects of the problems we confront. Each one needs to be confronted separately, but there's a connectivity to them that only us intellectuals, and I'm including those who are joining us from elsewhere, have to commit ourselves to doing, to ensure that we don't reject an aspect of anything from the academy. Because when we do that from the academy, we're denying that space elsewhere. It has a run-on effect in our schools, and that's why young people don't even know, many of our kids don't have a home language that they can proudly call their own. In fact, I know for a long time, pre-apartheid, that you could not talk about mother tongue, because my mother may have spoken a different language, my father may have spoken a different language, but there was a language they spoke of between themselves, which may have excluded us as kids. So we need to seriously rethink what has been described historically as the third most diverse society on earth. And how can we use the elements of success elsewhere to alleviate the burden the majority, the vast majority in our society carry on our behalf, because we tend to ignore them. And especially our leadership completely makes them invisible.
Thank you, Saths. I think I'm talking. I think it was what's Samuel Johnson, the British writer, who said patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel.
Yeah.
I think you're raising the issue of the need for us in the academy to speak truth to power, and most of us are retreating into our, I think, ivory towers. Thank you for acknowledging, Saths, that we've got people from international centers. We've got colleagues from Nigeria and Canada online. There's someone who's a friend of yours and mine, Jay Nair from Canada. He says, what is it in the psyche of
we
a
lived in
leader?
the same building. He was my protector when we lived in Himalaya House.
Okay, great.
He
Warwick,
and his late brother, yeah.
What is in the psyche of a leader that tends to engage in bribery and corruption after a struggle? We have this in the West too, but we have the ballot box to use to kick them out.
Well, we can't use the ballot box here because we don't have the first past the post system.
Yeah,
it's the party system. And even when the Concord decided in June 21 that Parliament should review the electoral laws, they made it so punitive, and eventually they dropped some of the punitive clauses. However, no individual was able to survive because no individual is going to make the numbers. We need a mixture of proportional representation. I believe that at the time that the CODESA stuff was happening, and I still believe that, because you have in local government a 50-50 differentiation, 50% for parties and 50% for individual candidates. Most of us, especially the educated, don't know that that 50% exists. Because if we actually knew that largely they're clouded by the same logos and flags of the parties, you don't have that representational system. And that's part of the reason why you also have protests. The accessible people are your local councillors, and most of the protests tend to happen at that level. And you have the worst, you supposedly have the best in executive leadership. I'm not going to comment about that. I think they're mediocre. But you're then supposed to have the parliaments, and then the provinces, and then the local government. Local government, clearly, by all accounts, including the Auditor General's account, are the worst. So there's no representation. You can't go to your councillor, except, by the way, if they are one of the right-wing parties. Your right-wing party people do respond. However, the majority of people don't relate to those right-wing parties. So the system, and a very good comrade of mine, Omri, has raised consistently within the ANC, that you capture the party, you capture the state. And that's part of what he's been putting out, and he continues to hold that position. I think that is very true, because if you capture the party, your party is reliant on Anglo-American De Beers funding. One of the grandchildren or great-grandchildren is able to give you more money. You can win an election. But will some of us here, with our views, end up getting that money? And will we seek that money? I think we won't seek that money. But that is one of our problems. I alluded to the problem of violence and that how the US plays itself out here. The electoral politics are almost replicated here so quickly under democracy. And while some people start blaming Cyril Ramaphosa for bribery and corruption of the ANC delegates, it happened before that. Many of us know that. You know, we knew who was campaigning for who and what money was at play here. Now you got to ask yourself, why would these people do that? For the power they have and can get rich on. Maybe I'm beginning to understand what Arthur Goldrich said years ago. He said, and you know, he said it, I mean, this is a communist, and he said it, and I thought it was such liberal hogwash, that you must understand, people came from very poor, needy backgrounds, and therefore they're looking for a better life for themselves. That partially, you know, answers that question. But how many of us here grew up in the lap of luxury? Jay, you managed to survive. I managed to survive. Enver, your family struggle. Ahmed, your family struggle. Bridge, you came from the township near Bang with all its refineries, right? But we haven't gone that route. So there's something else that attracts people now who go into politics that make the best, the brightest minds, especially young people, shun the political arena. And you know how many people have spoken that if you leave politics to others, you must expect idiots to run your lives.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Saths. In fact, many of my own students told me they will not consider a career in politics. I just want to add this meeting I learned, since we are talking about Saths was in Robben Island, and Jay Naya is the younger brother of Billy Naya. I heard that Billy Naya had was imprisoned in Robben Island. He was one of the earliest political prisoners before Mandela, which was an interesting point. We'll talk about that later.
He was there in 63.
There's an important question, yes, Saths, about should the humanity electives, it's very interesting, be mandatory for all degrees, including science, to kind of promote critical thinking?
Yeah. Look, I can only give the examples I know. At UWC, we did a foundational course. It's all first years had to do. It was compulsory. Critical thinking, comprehension, passages, poetry, etc., etc., etc. You had to analyze and so on. And going there as a senior lecturer in my first year in 1990, I was given first years to deal with. Right? I had, I think, at least 2 first years groups to deal with, and they were large groups. The problem with that foundational course was it was an elective. Instead of it becoming what they do in other places. In the UK, they have A levels. In the US, there's another year, they have community colleges bridging a university. We have a system where you have 12 years and then go straight into an area of future profession. We don't have a general degree, whether it's in the sciences, hard or social or humanities, whether it is in any other area that includes compulsory subjects. I'm going to use the traditional language. Language is important. I think you need another language as well. UCT, for instance, has made successful its medical course because it's required Xhosa to be spoken. Is it Xhosa as a spoken language? Otherwise, how do you engage with your patient? Others are now considering that option. How do you engage with somebody else in your work environment when they're speaking their home language and you feel offended, you're being excluded by it? So I think besides English, there should be another language, and it shouldn't be a European language. It should be a local language, a conversational one, an introductory course. In isiZulu in KZN, it's a non-start, it's a non-negotiable. In Free State, Sesotho. In other places, there may be a debate about which language to use. In fact,
Yeah, I think there's an interesting comment from, once again, another senior colleague of ours, Professor Betty Govenden, which states that theatre was a space for critical, creative thinking and political action.
Yeah.
Raj, from your side, have we looked at all the questions or most of them?
Hi. There are a few questions in the question and answer box too.
Okay, the Q&A section, okay.
No, Betty is correct. I think she's also alluding to the fact that some of us come from other backgrounds. I mean, I wanted to major in speech and drama, but when I was rusticated from University College Durban, I couldn't do speech and drama. So I ended up doing law. And I went to Robben Island. I decided, and there's no commentary on anybody else, I decided I'm not going to come out of here and swear allegiance to this corrupt, rotten, horrific state. So I chose psychology. I needed a profession. It's almost like, post-pogroms, Jews decide you should have something that you can rely on. I am not a tradesperson. I am not an engineer type. So I graduated with 3 majors, English, philosophy, and psychology. I could have taught, but I decided I'll do my psychology and do a PhD. Interestingly, I was denied from state institutions as an intern and so on and so on and so on. But that's a story for another day. However, I ended up, doing whatever I had done and rising to international and other office long before my predecessors and some of my lecturers as well.
Thank you. Saths, I'm just going to wrap it up. There's 2 or 3 questions linked to the inability of primary school kids to read with comprehension in any of the languages. Now, there's a acronym, and I've forgotten what it stands for, PIRLS. These are comparative studies, and I know we are right at the bottom of the pile.
Yes.
And linked to that is a question of about a shortage of stories for actually children's story books. And this is coming from Ella Gandhi, who's going to call you after this talk. I'm not going to tell you anything more, Saths, from the Gandhi settlement in Phoenix. So there's a lack of storybooks in the different languages for young kids. So it's about how do we get young people to read with understanding? And obviously, once people are able to read with understanding, they tend to improve in all other facets of the academy.
Well,
Over to you.
look, we've got living legends right now amongst us, and we need to use those living legends before they die. A lot of people who are involved in different aspects of opposition to the state as it was, and who now are available to provide their stories and their experiences in a Q&A fashion. And both Enver Daniels and I are in Robben Island Museum, and we want to see ex-political prisoners being accessed by schools, by universities in their local areas. And there's still some 700 living ex-political convicted prisoners. You have a lot of others who are detainees, but those who've spent time behind bars in Fort, in Kroonstad, in the other dungeons, and Robben Island are a few. They can add to the story. Betty, you, Bridge, others who are over 50 can talk of your experiences, because our kids actually have no reference point for what was then compared to what is now. And there is not a single sign that's still available, except on eBay and other places where they'll be traded at a high price on, saying net for blankers, and we don't have that historicity locally to understand that that fire that took place last year in Albert Street was the headquarters of the pass laws, iniquitous pass laws. And we end up blaming other Africans for being there and dying, you see? So it's stuff like that which can bring a reality, besides the lack of encouragement of creativity in whatever form, in the written, spoken, performed, and other forms. That creativity is dulled, and that needs to change.
Thank you, Saths. You refer to net blankers. I've just returned from the International Geography Union Congress in Dublin, where the airport, where you, depending on which queues you stand in, it says non-Europeans. So I took a photograph of that to show that in South Africa it will be quite offensive in the present age to have such a phrase.
Yeah, but that includes Brits, by the way, because they left
Yeah.
the EU. Okay, the non-Europeanism that the non-European unity movement of yore was appalled by, and then the Black consciousness epoch is very different from looking at it in that way, Bridge, and I think we are sensitive enough to know that. But to refer to us here as non-white is offensive. And our media has felt braver now to do that. And pockets of neo-fascist groupings feel you don't belong here. Hartbeespoort, Pretoria, and certain suburbs, you don't belong here. And that's because our democracy has tolerated that kind of thing. So, a simple explanation on that is don't inferiorize anybody. Why should you, Bridge, be called non-Saths? You can only be Bridge. How can I refer to anybody as this bottle? So when I remove white from the term non-white, I'm left with nothing, nil, negative. We're not negative. We're part of that humanity that needs to be restored in ourselves. And it's only the humanities that should not have electives, but should have compulsory modules, even if it's introductory level, that should expose all first-year students across faculties. Otherwise, we're disabling them in their work and their career pathing in the future, and we make them misfits in a South Africa that is very diverse.
Thank you, Saths. I think the humanities are under pressure globally in the academy, and because they're not seen to be generating, income or producing specialists like the engineers or the accountants, etc. But I think we've covered almost all the questions. I'm now going to hand over to Prof. Stephanie Burton, who is the interim president and chairperson of ASSAf, and she's from the University of Pretoria, who's going to offer some reflections and vote of thanks. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. May I just ask the those who are controlling this to allow me to switch on my camera, because at the moment I'm not allowed to. So apologies, colleagues, that you can't see me. It's that the host has stopped my video. So let me carry on anyway. Colleagues, we have heard a talk tonight, or this afternoon, which has been amazingly deep and very thought-provoking. We started with the consideration of, are we failing our children? And as we've gone through this, I'm actually kind of working backwards through my notes, which I've taken a great many of. But really, the end part of this discussion has really been around a broader area. So let me go back to our youth and the message of, are we failing our youth? And I think from what we've heard, there's a very clear message that we can't ignore what has in fact been a failure to some of our children, or to our children, failing our youth, the fact that they need to develop and feel ownership, that we need to provide them with some beacons of hope, and make some kind of amends or compensate in some way for the many difficulties that our youth has experienced, is experiencing. And one of the most ringing messages that you gave us, Professor Cooper, was about the fall list movement and the fact that the students at that time of Fees Must Fall were so very demonstrative of their frustration and the feeling that they, in fact, were being vocal, but that they did not have that sense of ownership of their environment, and that they took pride in it. That issue of burning the library really does come home to me, to hear a very clear message that we needed to understand that more clearly. And I speak humbly from not being a specialist in the humanities at all, but your message was very clear that we do need to somehow recreate that feeling of reconciliation and reconstructiveness that we had during Mandela's time. And taking it more broadly from there, the messages that you gave us of this very fragile and constrained world in which our children now live and now find themselves trying to make amends. There you go. You now can see me talking. I think there were some messages too, which perhaps as an optimist, I would like to see some hope. One of them is the opportunity that now, if we can just pay attention to it, we can take advantage of the fact that our children, even in this fragile world, are tech savvy. They are capable. And if we can just somehow harness that and direct it, we can perhaps make sure that our youth do not feel that they are surplus, that they are at the forefront of a struggle, not only against violence and conflict, but with their environment and with their communities and with their parents. I also heard very clearly when you started your talk the challenges of issues like malnutrition and how many of our children are malnourished, live below the poverty line, and in fact will be even more compromised as climate change takes more and more effect. So having listened to all of that, and for me, very consciously being aware of the very fragile future that we face, I think there are just a couple of messages I'd like to just highlight. One of them was the fact that we really do need to think about education broadly, the way in which we educate at school, at university, and that need to include much more breadth and depth in education, that multidisciplinary view, the teaching or the inclusion of programs which take in the liberal arts, drama, arts, music, languages, and educate our children more, our students more, about their history and their community and their environment. And let me just draw one last connection there, and that is representing ASSAf as I am this evening. ASSAf says, and we do claim, that we provide expert advice in the sciences. We seek to advance the sciences in society. And we, in our definitions and in our strategies and mission statements and so on, always emphasize that we say science in its broadest sense to include the humanities and social sciences and the arts. I think, Professor Cooper, you've given us a challenge there, and I think we need to think hard about how we, as the Academy of Science of South Africa, do exactly what we claim, and that is to make sure that we advance science in society in its broadest and deepest sense, and that we ensure that in our goals and aims, we try to inculcate that depth of understanding of the implications and the importance of deep in education and the breadth that you have shown us this evening in terms of the humanities and the arts and the importance of that for our youth. So finally, let me say thank you, Professor Cooper, for a very broad but also a very deep presentation, for showing us your vast knowledge of the history of our nation and our national position. It's been very provoking, very thought-provoking, and challenging to us as the Academy. So we are very grateful for you for taking the time and giving us such an informative and relevant talk this evening. Before I close, I would like to just thank a few others, in particular, Raj Mahabir, who has been organizing this and has been coordinating today. Also, of course, our Executive Officer, Professor Himla Sudyal, and her Manager for Strategic Partnerships, Dr. Malusi Twala, and then other members of the ASSAf Secretariat, Ms. Marvin Satari, Kulani Mbitsa, Dr. Tuzama Kubani, Henriette Wagner, who has been our communications help and has made all these wonderful invitations in the program, and then Renata Veneer and Ina Smith, who also have helped with coordinating all of this. And let me thank very sincerely the Humanities Standing Committee, Chair and Vice Chair, who are here, who have assisted with all the arrangements and have assisted with producing this talk this afternoon. Colleagues, I am sitting here, believe it or not, in the UCT Business School giving you this lecture. So let me also just say thank you to them for giving me the venue and the space. And thank you to all of the audience for your participation, for all of those who have asked such provoking questions. And thank you all for this amazing couple of hours. So again, thank you, Professor Cooper. We have thoroughly appreciated your expertise and your insights today. Thank you.
With my pleasure. Thank you all very much.